Hello, my beautiful ladies. Today I want to talk about what I refer to as the riverbed and the river movement for women. So this concept, again, I keep giving credit to Mina Irfan. She is the first person that I heard refer to these concepts describing masculine energy and feminine energy. And it was the best way for me to really resonate with this information because at the beginning, it did not make sense to me. And so I am going to start referring to this as the riverbed and the river, or the river flow movement. I believe this movement, at least for me, starts with more of an internal movement than the collective, because I feel like there are parts of us, there are parts of myself that I needed to heal before I could show up with the group or the collective. So I really view this as more of an internal movement that hopefully the overflow will spill into the collective for women. But this idea is for women who have primarily been in their doing and building phase, like a lot of us, because we have the rights to, get an education and to be in the workforce. This has opened up so many doors for us to learn how to stand on our own 2 feet, so to speak. Learn how to do things for ourselves. I feel like growing up in the 80s, there was definitely the sense of the last thing, it wasn't specifically spoken, the words weren't specifically spoken, but the message somehow was delivered to me in a way where I heard from older women, the last thing you want to do is be a helpless, dependent housewife. That is not the goal. Do whatever you have to do to not be that person. Make sure you have your own bank account. Don't rely on a man. And so learning these messages and then also having these opportunities, if you're like me, many of us have grown up focused on getting an education, building our skills, getting a career, being able to be that independent, strong female, right? And I think all of these were necessary for us to get to the next place as a collective, where now we have choice. I was talking with a girlfriend a couple years back. We were both getting our MBA, and we were having a conversation, just kind of laughing of, okay, well, I think we were dating somebody at the same time, and we were both talking about also marriage and getting married. And we just had this kind of moment where we were like, so if we're getting married, why are we sacrificing all of this time and getting an MBA and staying up late for our capstone projects? And if we're going to end up just getting married, why not just rely on that? Why are we doing this? Why are we working so hard? And we both came to the conclusion that we're doing this so that we can have choice. So that we can have choice. Do we want to stay home or do we want to go into the workforce? If we decide to have kids, do we want to stay home with the baby or our kids? Or do we want to stay home with the baby, but then when our kids get a little bit older, then go back and have a career that we can go to where if anything happens, We can stand on our own 2 feet. We are in a secure position. And ultimately, I'm realizing now it was all about feeling safe. Because in order to access these things, you have to feel safe, right? For these things to come up. And so I believe, and these are the women that I'm speaking to, if you have been told these things, especially in early childhood, a lot of things are good. There is a time and place for these things, and it's important because our previous ancestors, the women in our families, did not have that choice. And so I do believe that there was a need for this movement, right? For feminism and things like that. I believe it's important for 2 people to feel like they can come together, but not be in a desperate situation where one person needs someone more than the other person. Because a lot of times that can get into a power play or a power dynamic. And so many of us have been building ourselves up to be the riverbed. At least I know I was. And what is the riverbed? The riverbed, if you think about it, is a structure, right? It's a container. It is more focused on the external. It is rigid. It needs to be rigid because if it rains or it's holding the water flow or the river, it needs to be rigid. It can't be soft, because what would happen if the riverbed all of a sudden just kind of melted away? What happens to a river or water flow? And you've seen this even on the street, I feel like, as a child. I know, running around barefoot back in the day, and maybe, you know, a fire hydrant or something has leaked and there's water trickling out. That water that doesn't have that container, if it does have the container, what happens? A lot of times there's flow, right? It pulls it together for movement. But what happens when there's not the container and it flattens out? A lot of times the water goes into streaks in multiple directions. And eventually it dries out. Eventually, if there is not flow to move the water, it dries out. And so the interesting thing I found, so let's talk a little bit more of the riverbed. So the riverbed for me was going, achieving. It was making enough money to pay my rent. It was making enough money to pay the utilities. The idea of saving up possibly for a mortgage. Being able to cover my own health insurance. Having money in the bank. Having resources to take care of my basic needs. Food, shelter, water, clothes. And eventually, my hope was to build up enough to go from making sure I can take care of what I need to taking care of then exploring what I want, which is actually more of the river and the river flow. So the riverbed for me was more about taking care of those basic needs and having those habits, that discipline, sacrificing for the future, pushing through no matter what, no matter how I feel, actually trying not to even have time to know how I feel because that's going to distract me. I need to think. Gosh, back in college, I remember that they were training us when you write an email in the workplace, never phrase it as I feel like, always phrase it as I think. So early on, getting trained to be that riverbed, right? To take care of myself and not need anybody, not needing to ask for help, not falling into that idea of wanting to avoid at any cost, somehow ending up being a helpless, dependent housewife. And so while I was working on building myself up as a riverbed, it was great, but I wasn't accessing things that I wanted. There are things that you can do by yourself, which is great because you have the flexibility and the freedom to kind of do what you want to do. You don't need to ask or check in with somebody else. But I also found that there's something beautiful about experiencing life with another person. And if that other person ends up being the riverbed, and that's where their strengths are, then that would allow me to start to access getting to be the river, getting to be more of being tuned in with my body, being tuned in with my feelings, being tuned in with pleasure, being tuned in with enjoyment, having space, not just time, but space to enjoy life. And one thing that I found was at the beginning of my marriage, my union, we were both being the riverbed. And how do you think that worked out over the long run? When you're both being the riverbed, you're being disciplined, you're having structure, you're having systems, but there's no river flow. There's no space. There's no time for enjoyment. There's no time for spontaneity. There's nobody holding that space in the relationship. It ended up being very imbalanced. And phrases that would come up into the, relationship is, what are we working so hard for? Because both of us were being the riverbed. The riverbed, what's the point in being a riverbed if there's no river? And I want to invite everyone to consider this, consider some of these thoughts. The main reason why the riverbed is the riverbed is so it can be a container for the river. Because what is the riverbed without the river? There's no nourishment. There's no water. There's no nurturing. And so even a riverbed eventually, while it can be great at being the riverbed, is going to eventually pause and look around and say, why am I doing this? And vice versa. What is the river without the riverbed? If there's not that container or that structure to allow the water to collect, so there is movement, there is that flow, what happens with stagnant water? A lot of times there's disease, or as people say, and Oprah says, dis-ease. The riverbed and the river actually need each other. Do you have to want to need each other? No, but brought together, it's a beautiful union. You can do more together than you can do separately. And so my mission in my heart, because of all the things that I've been through and my life experiences, and they won't be exactly the same as yours, that's not the point. But I have a desire for women who have been primarily the riverbed, and they've gotten really good at being that riverbed. And maybe they are wanting to enter into a relationship, or they're in the early phase of a relationship, or maybe they're a little further in and they're realizing what they've been doing is no longer working anymore. Something's missing, like it was for me. And a lot of times when we as women, because we have different hormones, we have, biologically, we are different. We are equal, but we are different. I tried to be equal and the same with my husband at the beginning. So when he had a lot of testosterone, which men have more testosterone, pumping through his body, and he wanted to do a project and get it done in 16 hours in one day versus spreading it over multiple days. Early on in our relationship, I would do the same, and I would literally collapse, and he would feel so much accomplishment and just kind of veg out the next day and relax. But I would feel so depleted because I was trying to be equal and do things in the same way he was doing, instead of recognizing I have a different body. I am the river flow. That is what I identify more as, having more of the feminine essence in our relationship. And one of the things this started to cause was health issues. And I'll be going into that as well in some future videos. And I will try to link that in the description box below later on after I post them. So anyway, just wanted to share, if you haven't heard this concept, I invite you to check in with yourself, to check in with your body, to check in with your mind. How are you doing? Are you feeling depleted? Are you running your body into the ground? How's that working out for you? I know it didn't end up working well for me. Eventually, I had to learn how to do things differently and how to do things in another way. And I had to change my beliefs around these things. And so I will be sharing more. I hope everyone's having a great day, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.